Thanks everyone for joining in, and thanks for the opportunity to actually present this project. It was really exciting to work on it together with Jan and my academy. It is a project called ChoreIsle, which is a research concept about chores and their gamification. So what did I research? The exact topic I researched was finding motivation to do daily chores, or more precisely, what kind of gamified design intervention can increase the motivation to do chores. I looked to video games and asked myself the questions, how do people get motivated to do repetitive tasks in video games? And can it be utilized to make chores more enjoyable? To answer this question, I utilized research triangulation made up of literature review, qualitative interviews, and concept testing. So to start out with the literature review, the key insights I gathered from it were the concepts of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. These are very useful concepts to know about since they define most of human behavior, and at their core, they are actually quite simple. First, I'll start with extrinsic motivation. This one forms when something external compels you to engage in an activity. Things like rewards or your boss assigning you a task. So pretty much any activity where you seek the end result, not the process itself. Um, yes, this is like any rewards, monetary rewards, and so on. On the other hand, intrinsic motivation forms when you internally want to engage in an activity because you enjoy the process and find it fulfilling. There are also other subdivisions of these concepts, and my aim with the prototype was to achieve extrinsic motivation with integrated regulation. It sounds very fancy, but in essence, what it means that something external will still tell the users or the players to do a chore, but if they will enjoy the process enough, they will still gain the same benefits as with intrinsic motivation. To achieve this motivation, three psychological needs need to be fulfilled according to the self-determination theory. These are competence, which is that you feel like you can perform an action, that you are competent enough to do it. Then autonomy, that's the feeling that you are in control of that action. And lastly, relatedness, that's the feeling of connection to someone or something through that activity. If all three needs are satisfied, then a person can achieve intrinsic motivation. Out of this theory, a gameful design approach has been created by Sebastian Deterding called the lens of intrinsic skill atoms. Experts don't want to call it the gamification as much anymore. It's people are pivoting to gameful design instead, which is an evolution of gamification where instead of slapping points and leaderboards and badges on everything like most companies do these days, you try to utilize the characteristics of gameplay to create similar motivating and enjoyable experiences in non-gaming contexts. I identified with this kind of mindset and still do, so I decided to use this approach to design my concept. So then I move on to the second part of my research triangulation, which was interviews. I conducted 9 qualitative interviews with representatives of my target audience and 3 with game designers. With the target audience, I mainly wanted to understand their needs and their frustrations. when it comes to household chores. And also, I wanted to understand how do they perceive repetitive tasks in video games. By repetitive tasks, I mean grinding for resources, for example. Then I interviewed also some game designers to understand some or find some game design techniques I could utilize in my process. The collected insights from the target audience suggest there is a connection between how people get motivated to do chores and repetitive tasks in video games. I identified the suggestion based on two key similarities. The end goal serves as the main motivator in both, and the process almost always feels mundane or repetitive unless supported by some intrinsic motivators. In games, it would be, for example, satisfying combat. If you are enjoying the combat enough, you are willing to do things over and over again that way. That was at least with my target audience. Uh, I also want to double down on the fact that this is just a suggestion. I did not have nearly enough participants to have to say like this is something definitive or something you can generalize. So yeah, it's just a suggestion for my target audience and something I've really focused on for the rest of my project. There were also other insights like that there is a very strong external motivator at play during chores. If another human is involved in during the chores, the target audience immediately feels more accountable. And moreover, I also identified that if you want to achieve intrinsic motivation in video games and while doing any repetitive tasks, you might need progress visibility and responsive feedback to achieve that. And from my talks with game designers, I explored various game design theories like core loops or player engagement. But more importantly, I was able to define three design pillars for my concept, which were progress visibility, goal orientation, and social elements. To design the concept solution, I adapted the gameful design approach I mentioned before. I'll quickly take you through the whole process of applying the approach so you can just see how it looks and maybe you get inspired for your own projects or your own games in the future. At the beginning, I needed to define the target outcome, which is achieve or reinforce users' extrinsic motivation with integrated regulation while completing chores. With any goals you set, it's always good to also define how are you going to measure success or fulfillment of that goal you set. I'll dive deeper into the measurements later. And lastly, I also had to define the target action. So the core activity around which the design will be built or was built. In my instance, it was completing chores, which is, to clarify it, it is the mental or physical process of marking or checking that you have done or completed a chore. Usually people do it, or from my target audience, I found out they usually do it just mentally, just saying, okay, I've now vacuumed, it's done. But also some people use, I don't know, whiteboards or to-do apps and so on. Using the data I collected during research, I defined the target audience through a user persona and a technique called jobs to be done. User persona, or in this case, player persona, is a necessity when designing anything these days. But I also recommend jobs to be done, which is this right part of this screen. Uh, if you don't know what it is a technique where you, in a sense, you try to identify which jobs your users want to achieve in a specific context. Um, that way you can then design something that will help them fulfill these jobs. So the way I used it, I defined these jobs, and when I was designing the prototype, I always went back and asked myself, okay, am I including everything? Um, am I including as much as possible for my users to be then able to complete these jobs? With the jobs defined, I started brainstorming using the innovation stems and design lenses. I discovered both of these for the first time during this project, and they're both really good, especially for people that have non-game design background. Innovation stems, which are down here, Are sets of questions that you can use to kickstart your brainstorming, and they enable you to cover a wide range of topics. These particular stems were created by deterring the author of the gameful design method I was following, but you can use the same concept under any context, in my opinion, if you just adapt the questions, because these one are focused on gamification. But if you change the question to something else, it's really similar, for example, to how might we questions. If you've ever encountered those, it's very similar to that. And then once you're done with brainstorming through the stems, you can start using design lenses. They build upon the ideas that you gathered and help you iterate on them. Let's say that I have an idea about making the progress of vacuuming visible. To design this feature, you can use design lenses to put the idea under a different perspective and ask yourself some questions to help you flesh out the feature. I mainly used these three that you can see on the screen in my brainstorming, but the turning created like, I think at least 20 of them that you can just go through and ask yourself different questions and again iterate on the ideas until you are satisfied with the final result. Then I collected all of the ideas and tried to find overlaps. I wasn't yet sure which concept would be the most suited solution, so I decided to storyboard the most promising ones. Here you can see some of my storyboards. In the end, I chose like three concepts to continue with, storyboarded them, and um, I kept it really simple to really identify which of the concepts is the most promising in terms of long-term progress and customization. And in the end, it was the building concept you could see here. I like designed this at the time. It was called Chore Builder, and it was based on a similar idea as the final prototype, but still not the final concept that you are going to see later. And before moving on to Figma, I also defined the user flow of the prototype. And this is how the final prototype looked. I included only the core activity of building islands as a form of progression. So every time you complete a chore, you would get the chance to build an island in the app. And that way you could visualize the progress of you over and over cleaning your house. And a lot of my participants from the target audience, they said that there is a lack of progression when they are cleaning. So this was my innovation stem of like asking myself, okay, how can I visualize progress? Because at home they cannot see it enough, or it is so repeated that they don't see the progress anymore. Uh, Going back to the literature review, for this prototype, I mainly focus on fulfilling competence and autonomy. So again, feeling that they are competent enough to do an activity and that they are in control of that activity. But unfortunately, this is when like one of the first setbacks came for me for this project was that I couldn't focus on relatedness at all because any social feature would be really hard to reliably simulate. It's definitely possible. I even had the idea of recruiting 3 to 5 households of 3 to 4 people and let them use this kind of prototype for at least a week. That way you could see between the households how they are utilizing the social features and if it's motivating them enough to do chores and enjoy the chores and so on. So it's definitely possible. It just wasn't in my time frame and resources to do testing like that. But I still had to test the concept, and it still had to be over time. So I at least chose a 3-day test, and I recruited 7 participants, and they got to use the prototype 1 to 2 times each day. That way, I could see if any changes in motivation will happen, and how participants will perceive the concept's value of or usefulness over time. And again, not relying on just one approach, I used a mixed method of quantitative questionnaires and qualitative post-test interviews. To measure the motivational levels, I used a method called intrinsic motivation inventory. It is quite a complex collection of subscales that measure different parts of intrinsic motivation. The way you use the inventory is pick only the subscales you want to measure. For example, you can see here the first one is interest and enjoyment, which actually measures the overall intrinsic motivation. But if you want to just focus on autonomy, you can always just measure perceived choice. And here they are just the items are called, these are just like questions that you ask. And actually in the actual inventory, there are, I think, at least 5 to 7 questions for each of these subscales that you then ask the participants, and you can determine their level of intrinsic motivation or their level of autonomy and so on. I definitely recommend utilizing this if you want to measure motivation in any way. It has been proven over time by multiple studies, and there are even examples of it being used for video games and to measure player motivation. For my project, the overall result was that intrinsic motivation did not rate high after the first day of using the prototype, and it went slightly down across most measures by the third day. If this trend were to continue like this, most users would probably stop using the concept after a week. I kind of expected this result because, again, I had to skip over any social features. And from what I found out from my research, where they said that social accountability is really high during chores. If they know if any human is involved, they immediately feel more motivated to do the chores. So any social feature is really key to achieve intrinsic motivation in chores. Um, to identify how to improve the prototype, in the next iteration, I conducted 15-minute interviews with each of the participants. Some of the key takeaways I got from that were that the app is not connected enough to the chores. Most of the participants desired a bigger narrative integration, and they expressed concerns about longevity of the progress. If any further development of this concept were to happen, I would recommend starting with these areas and focusing on the whole, or should I say, a holistic experience, as it does matter in this context. There are a lot of features and a lot of facts that have to really click in place for people to be able to enjoy using the app and for them to feel motivated to do the chores and on top of that use the app at the same time. For example, I wanted to add sound effects to my prototype, but Figma cannot do that for some reason. They still do not offer the opportunity to use sound effects in it. So that was one of the parts I just couldn't add. And especially, I would recommend starting with the narrative integration part. A lot of the participants mentioned that like they would need something to connect to and to immerse themselves in using the app. I brainstormed on it even after the project was done, and it would be difficult to create any sustainable way to include a narrative in this kind of concept, but it would be possible in my opinion. For example, I would take inspiration from games like The Sims or Call of the Lamb, where we can see examples of players creating their own narratives or that the game permutates the same narrative concepts. So it's definitely possible to make it sustainably. It just would take time to develop. So now we're getting to the end of the presentation. The overall outcome, I would say, is that since I only had 9 weeks to conduct this research and I worked alone, it was pretty hard for me to get any valid or definitive results. I did not manage to recruit enough participants and the test period was really short. But what I realized after handing in the thesis is that the process I pitched is actually quite solid. And that's something also that was highlighted during my exam. That they said that they really believe the process I created could be utilized under a similar concept of trying to develop some gamified concept to help with chores, that this concept could be utilized, or this process could be utilized to create that. Yeah, and I think I also gathered some useful suggestions and useful first insights from my target audience that can be used as a foundation for any further development of this kind of concept.